Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Welcome back to the second afternoon session of our colloquium conference, Social Ontologies after DELEUZE. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Janae Sholtz, who lectures at Alvernia University. She's the author of The Invention of a People, Heidegger and Deleuze on Art and the Political, published by Edinburgh Press in 2015. And also the editor of Deleuze and the Schizoanalysis of Feminism, Alliances and Allies for Bloomsbury, and a special journal edition entitled Infinite Eros, Deleuze, Guattari and Feminist Couplings. Janae Sholtz has published research in the areas of continental philosophy, feminist theory, philosophy of art, and social and political philosophy. The title of her presentation today is Interrogating the Cartographies of New Materialist Feminism, the Linguistic Turn, the Posthuman, and the Transcontinental Divide. So the stage is yours, Janae.
Thank you so much. First, let me thank Peter for organizing this amazing event for us and the opportunity to get together and to share our ideas. I know that this is the first time in several years where I've been able to share my work and to discuss with people who are like-minded and have interesting creative things to think and to say, so I am very appreciative to be here. And the paper that I'm giving today, I'll just briefly sort of contextualize. I'm writing a book that I'm tentatively titling Messy Materialism, and I tend to draw several things together in my work. So Deleuze, I am a Deleuzian. I'm also a feminist, so as a feminist, sort of being aware of different trends, new materialism and new materialist feminism has really taken center stage. And I noticed that often it seems that when someone is labeled a Deleuzian feminist, it's assumed that they're a new materialist. And so I really was interested in interrogating sort of how the new materialist conception and interpretation of Deleuze has almost overwhelmed any other version. And for me, as a Deleuzian, I have some challenges. This is challenging. I think it's there's some delimitations that are problematic, and so the book is trying to reincorporate the incorporeal elements of Deleuze into a sort of feminist Deleuzian perspective. So much of this is the setup of the cartographies of new materialism to figure out what they both enable and disable. So very much in line with what Ian talked about earlier with the different interpretations, how they can both be misinterpretations but also be creative. I think there's something of that going on with new materialism that I would like to explore. So in the prologue of Metamorphosis, Rosie Braidotti presents her approach as cartographic or cartographical. And again, in the Posthuman in 2013, she invokes cartography as a key feature of posthuman critical theory, claiming that her golden rules are cartography accuracy with the corollary of ethical accountability, transdisciplinarity, the importance of combining critique with creative figurations, the principle of nonlinearity, the powers of memory and imagination, and the strategy of defamiliarization. Cartographies, she claims, aim at epistemic and ethical accountability by unveiling the power locations which structure our subject position and should be theoretically based and politically informed readings of the present. Thus, they are crucially important in giving the lay of the land, so to speak, so that we can identify the influencing and limiting factors on behavior and interactions. Yet she also insists that critiques of power locations are not enough. They work in tandem with the quest for alternative figurations or conceptual persona for these locations in terms of power as restrictive, but also as empowering or affirmative. One of the ways of understanding this is to say that cartographies should be accurate in description, but what we do with the cartographies is another matter. They're always geared towards becoming. Metamorphosis is particularly significant in that it yields one of the first figurations of new materialism, its nascent contours with respect to the embodied subject, the materiality of bodies, and the specific temporal material conditions of bodies. Elements of the cartography that Braidotti creates there have been almost canonical for new materialism. It is there also that one finds Braidotti vehemently defending her creative appropriation of Deleuzean philosophy. One can palpably detect both suspicion of dogmatism that is accumulated in Deleuzean scholarship, the, as she says, rank and file or Oedipalized or orthodox Deleuzians, and her frustration with the reactions to feminist appropriations of Deleuze as unoriginal, inadequate, or off the point. While in agreement with that Deleuze never meant for his philosophy or concepts to become dogma, I do think that there's a tension here between creative appropriation and accuracy, which Braidotti seems to appeal to in her Golden Rules cartographical accuracy, but doesn't address in this earlier work. My point is not to criticize Braidotti's reading of Deleuze in this moment, but to problematize this loaded space of interpretation and conceptual appropriation overall, and to think retrospectively about the contours of the various cartographies that constitute new materialism. How have they solidified? What has been excluded or omitted? Effectively, I'm interested in assessing the costs and consequences for feminism of the meteoric rise of new materialism. So in what follows, I will engage three of these cartographies. The first, the linguistic turn, the second will be the transatlantic divide, and the third, posthuman. And it strikes me that the fourth part to this, which can only be spoken about after that, would be their cartography of ontology and the appropriation of Deleuze's relational ontology. So that can be for another time. So the first cartography. For new materialism, the rejection of the linguistic turn induces several major paradigm shifts. The rejection of anthropocentrism, the rejection of human exceptionalism, and the rejection of mind-body dualism, and provides ballast for a radical reorientation of theory and practice towards body and materiality. Situating itself as the antidote to these inhibiting intellectual assumptions, new materialism arises from a grounding cartographic moment. In an interview in which she reflects on the genealogical origin of new materialism, Braidotti explains the need to demarcate neo-materialism as a method and conceptual framework which refuses the linguistic paradigm in favor of, quote, complex materiality of bodies immersed in social relations of power. Essentially, the long-standing privileging of the power and role of language in constituting our reality and experience disregards the reality of matter itself and reflects a particular metaphysical concept of matter as something passive and inert, requiring human agency to take various shape and form. This is the hallmark of new materialist origination narratives. Linguistic and cultural theory cannot meet the needs for accurate portrayal of embodiment, environments, or complexity and the dynamics of life. The crucial idea is that materiality matters. Whether we conceive subjectivity in terms of some inner mental consciousness or psychic ego, or interpret our identities as purely a matter of social construction, there's always a material substrate that remains operative and effective. The effects of new materialist turn away from the linguistic turn are like a series of reverberations that sweep through multiple fields of inquiry, an entanglement of epistemology, ontology, ethics, and politics. Tracing these offshoots is the point where, following Braidotti, the cartography becomes a new figuration. Some of the main outlines of this ethico-onto-epistemological framework include transversality or nonlinearity as a response to rejecting nature, culture, and mind-body dualisms, conceptualization of matter as not subsidized by the linguistic paradigm, constituting a shift towards the vitality of materiality and independent contributions of corporeality as an ontological turn, insistence on embodied embedded subjectivities and the reconsideration of subject-object paradigm as such, and the shift in relation between materiality, language, and meaning towards non-anthropocentric affective and bodily engagements as meaning-making in themselves. Although this cartographic demarcation is primarily an enabling one, resulting in proliferation of many new materialist lines of flight outlined above, there's a manner in which the hesitance to address language, meaning, and thought in terms of human specificity, or provide a space for addressing the incorporeal, is limiting. When the nature of thought or meaning is broached, it's usually through the work of Karen Barad. She characterizes meaning, conceptualization, and or thinking as material practices, that is, doings and actings rather than mental reflection. Meaning becomes a matter of singularizing experience, an awareness of individuality of assemblages rather than general or representational knowledge. And thinking is seen as distributed across a wide spectrum of human and non-human entities rather than being associated primarily with the transcendent consciousness of human beings. As we know, feminist new materialists have gravitated towards Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy as a materialist ontology of dynamic flows and productive interaction transformation rather than a substantialist theory of matter. But is this the end-all be-all for Deleuze and Guattari? Deleuze and Guattari's philosophies are riddled with discussions of incorporeality, ideas, concepts, thought, and language. Under the ballast of critiquing the linguistic turn, anything that smacks of incorporeal or the immaterial is suspected of being a repeat of the traditional anthropocentric metaphysical prioritization of mind over body, the immaterial over the material. I believe that this is why you will see very little discussion of Deleuze's theory of desire or his discussion of thought or concepts in new materialist literature. They simply do not fit the model. This should give us pause. If the cartography that critiques the linguistic turn ends up eschewing all that is extra material, thought, consciousness, mind, we get to a point where, as Elizabeth Gross has rightfully recognized, new materialism cannot account for the immaterial events that we experience. Barad's assertion, for instance, that materiality itself creates meaning rather than being interpreted by meaning-giving agencies or subjects is an extraordinary leap, flattening of the difference between very different kinds or levels of activities. I take issue with how Barad's conception of the material discursive slides between assertions that matter and meaning are entangled to matter itself is meaning, or meaning is purely a material configuration. I have serious questions about what meaning becomes within this framework and whether this framework allows for making distinctions concerning matter, meaning, or if it just dilutes the sense of meaning-making altogether. Not to mention that this critique has the effect of foreclosing discussions simply by fact that it indicts practically every formal category of philosophy, critical or traditional. Whether phenomenology, post-structuralism, deconstruction, historical materialism, feminism, they are all tainted. Too much language, too much culture, too much about speaking, thinking individuals. Second, cartography, a transatlantic divide. As new materialist feminists have been quick to observe, the denigration of materiality, either by viewing it as passive and inert or through its general disregard and neglect, is one to which feminists have been intimately attuned because of how this view of nature and matter was associated with the feminine, as subsidiary or inferior to the masculine mind culture. This is one reason that it is quite difficult to imagine new materialism without feminism. At the same time, new materialist feminists see a major part of feminist theory as having become caught up with the linguistic turn. Alaimo argues that many feminists, from de Beauvoir forward, were caught up in, quote, a flight from nature, because of the desire to extricate women or woman from essentialist biological determinations and associations with passivity. She argues that these endeavors inadvertently reconfirm the nature-cultural dualism at the heart of such views by disassociating culture and gender from nature and sex. New materialists see themselves as both going beyond the hesitance that feminists have had in addressing nature and materiality for itself, because of the fear of reinforcing the negative patriarchal associations between the feminine and nature, and explicitly opposing social constructivist feminisms that privilege language and culture. This foregrounding of the terrain of feminism is not the whole story, though. This story is filtered through another demarcation, a transatlantic divide between American feminism and European feminism, which Braidotti articulates in her early work and reiterates in her retrospective reflection on the grounding cartographic impulses. This cartographic contour has had the effect of casting new materialism as a primarily European phenomenon, but more concerning is how this cartography so clearly disables specific dialogues and theoretical viewpoints within American feminism, constituting a reduction of potentiality rather than generative proliferation. In Metamorphosis, Braidotti laments the mixed and superficial reaction to European sexual difference theories in the United States and proposes that opposition to sexual difference in American feminist circles reflects more than just misreading, but instead, citing Chanter, reflects the way that the liberal political discourse of equal rights and the ideal of sameness rests behind the tendency to interpret sexual difference theory in terms of essentialism, universalism, and heterosexism. She also comments that, quote, opposition to it, sexual difference, generally coalesced around the concept of gender. In the United States, the sex-gender dichotomy that arises swings towards the pole of gender, disembodying it under cover of liberal rights and social constructive change. The problem is that gender theory tacitly assumes a passive body on which special codes are imprinted, end quote. After these comments, Braidotti spent several pages laying out her view of the American political landscape in the 1980s and 90s with respect to feminist discourse, describing how it was dominated by the likes of Dworkin and McKinnon, whose repressive campaigns against prostitution and pornography constituted sexuality as wholly oppressive and contributed to mainstream liberal feminism's eschewal of issues related to the body, pleasure, and eroticism. She finds support of her assessment in Gallup and Walters, as well as in the splashy lawsuits where sex and racialization coalesce in harassment lawsuits against several prominent black men. All of this leads to her matter-of-fact claim, quote, I would say that the body in U.S. feminism cannot be positively associated with sexuality in either the critical or public discourses. Sexuality, which is the fundamental paradigm in the critical discourse of psychoanalysis and post-structuralism, simply has no place in American political discourse. Now, let's sideline the slippage between critical and public discourse to specifically political discourse for a moment, to consider how utterly patronizing and disparaging this may seem to those who are researching, writing, and speaking about the body, sexuality, and eroticism in the United States at this time, especially beyond the 80s and 90s when Braidotti was surely writing the book. First, there are antitheses to the position which associates sexuality with domination and oppression, a whole tradition of sex-positivist feminism, and advocates for expression of female sexuality. Second, such a position seems to rely on a few critical accounts of the state of feminist theory. I can appreciate Tina Chander's frustration with the lack of reception of Continental philosophy while still rejecting Braidotti's conclusions. What seems to be like a voracious, yes. Now, perhaps what Braidotti claims can be applied to mainstream liberal feminism in its political instantiations, but most feminist theorists will recognize this as an anemic picture. What of Adrienne Rich's celebration of the power of female sexuality? Sarah Ruddock's positive construction of maternal bodies? Audre Lorde's brilliant invocation of the erotic and power? Suleiman's writing positively about French feminism and the female erotic? Fausto Sterling's work on biology and intersectionality? And of course, explorations of the lived body in the work of feminist phenomenologists such as Iris Marion Young. Gail Weiss, writing about embodiment as intercorporeality, and Sarah Ahmed addressing the embodiment of post-colonial others. The fact is that the discussion of embodiment and material relations not only exist, but are much more complex than credited. Moreover, to assume the critical discussion of female embodiment wasn't accompanied by calls for more positive accounts of female embodiment strikes me as naive, although it would satisfy a desire to draw a strong cartographical line that places body and materiality squarely within European new materialist territory. It seems that Braidotti mistakes discourses attempting to correct the tangible ways in which female bodies were constricted in American society for the whole of the discourse on sexuality and embodiment. It's disappointing, and unfortunately, it's stuck, at least in the cartography of new materialism. This division has been taken up as a cartographic fact, reflecting the propensity to speak of a monolithic American feminism, which is truly problematic. The residual effect of this cartography, which assumes stark contrast between American and European feminism, which, as we shall see, leads to reductive understandings, omissions of theoretical positions, and philosophically unfortunate situation whereby reference to said divide substitutes for any explanation whatsoever. So what has American feminism come to be associated with? Well, in a word, Butler, which is also how the American-European divide and the first cartographic divide become bound together. While Butler's work cannot be charged with dismissing issues of embodiment or sexuality, new materialists have come to understand her invocation of the body as not material enough, emphasizing the mattering over the matter. Again, we find the paradigmatic critique of Butler in Braidotti's Metamorphosis. Quote, Butler reduces morphology and bodily contours to discursive practices which act as interpretive matrices which both affect and limit access to bodily materiality, end quote. Braidotti advocates for the co-presence of morphological and social power relations and joint impact on the subject. What she likes about both Arrighi and DELEUZE is that they both insist upon the pre-discursive validity of the body in a way that Butler does not, which allows for sexually differentiated embodied subjects as opposed to sexuality as merely an outgrowth of cultural and discursive constraints. Since Butler's performative account of gender lends itself to cultural constructionist narratives, as bodies are shaped, rejected, endorsed according to dominant ideals in society, which is to say Butler takes the linguistic turn. And so the lineage and progression of so-called American feminism is viewed as unidirectionally and unitarily focused on linguistic social constructivism, whereas European feminism is not. So this narrative is a constitutive one, but also a constitutive blindness. Particularly glaring is that it overlooks the lineages of American Black feminism and U.S. Third World feminism, which represent vibrant and rich histories which are critical of the liberal political paradigm and have tools beyond the linguistic divide at their disposal, a counter-history which doesn't fit so well with the narrative that new materialism has banked itself on. This demarcation of American-European feminism reads as the desire to carve out a territory that neatly dispenses with other forms of feminism by claiming their insufficiency. Moreover, it perpetuates the marginalization of women of color feminisms, which, make no mistake, did also occur in U.S. liberal mainstream feminism, but it implicitly places marginalization from this liberal paradigm at the doorstep of Americanism, rather than recognizing that mainstream feminism has global connotations as well, connotations that involve European feminism as part of the Western European intellectual and theoretical hegemonies with respect to non-Western, post-colonial, and women of color feminisms. One of the ways this divide rears its head is in the way that identity politics is consistently denigrated in new materialism. While it's true that in American media and public rhetoric, identity politics has become a political football, anathema to the left and right alike, one doesn't expect critical intellectuals to follow suit. The criticism of identity politics has become the explanation du jour for why the left is divided, focusing too much on the needs and the interests of particular identities, to the detriment of focusing on systemic economic issues that affect everyone. On the right, the assumptions are more blatant. Identity politics is just a bunch of whining social justice warriors complaining about their plights, which are largely mythic or their own fault anyway. One could find that philosophical references to anything related to identity conjure association with state politics and the constitution of generic modes of identity, or are atemporal and stagnant. So this version of identity politics seems to underlie these critiques could stem from the equation of identity and individualism, that identity politics is just a Mickey Mouse refrain of me, me, me. Of course, this version of identity politics is a caricature of the reason identity remains important to consider in political frameworks, and those espousing the importance of categories or identities are operating with a much more nuanced understanding of the function and fluctuations of identity in our society. Women of color feminists explore the parameters of identity to call out the institutional barriers that affect particular members of society and make visible the material conditions of groups adversely affected by the conjunction of power, policy, and privilege. The models developed through intersectional analysis in particular do not seek to substantiate identity, but bring into focus its temporalities, historicities, and fluidities. And sometimes, yes, the perception of identities is ideological, and calling out the generic assumptions surrounding identities is part of the point. The social construction of identity is what identity politics is critiquing. And in the place where we attempt to deconstruct and eradicate the real effects of ideological constructions of identity. So speaking about these systematic constraints is not the solidification of an essentialized identity. Of course, these are political talking points. One might respond that philosophical critique of identity from post-structuralists and new materialists alike are more nuanced. They often follow along the lines of these. One, focusing on identities detracts from the underlying forces and conditions that are pre-personal. Two, identity operates through a philosophical illusion of the totality of self that erroneously places control in individuals. Or three, identity is grounded on a logic of exclusion, solidifying around subject positions which set up crude oppositions which fail to capture specificities or differences and limit fluidity and transformation. Philosophically, new materialists conflate intersectionality with oppositional logic and a crude substantialist identitarian subjectivity. So in this section, I go through those philosophical critiques and so, for instance, Gross argues that intersectionality perpetuates the classifications of oppression that it seeks to analyze. Barad proposes that her proposal of interaction as a superior mode of analysis to intersectionality is based on a similar criticism that intersectionality constitutes, quote, mutual perpendicular sets of axes of identification. And then Puar claims that no matter how intersectional our models of subjectivity, no matter how attuned to locational politics of space, place, and scale, these formulations still limit if they presume the automatic primacy and singularity of the disciplinary subject. So I fear that the need to juxtapose their own methodologies to intersectionality has made a straw man of the concept. Consider how Chicana feminists have issued nuanced accounts of complex shifting identities that elude the logic of exclusion for decades. In her work devoted to elaborating the indices of U.S. third world feminism, Shayla Sandoval articulates a concept of differential consciousness, which she contends has been practiced in U.S. third world feminism since the 1960s. Differential consciousness is topological rather than typological, and it indicates kinetic, self-consciously mobile ways of being that women of color have developed in response to marginalization and oppression, a concept of flexible identity. Moreover, Anzaldúa's invocation of identity as mestiza and Sherry Moraga's theories of the flesh situate identity within and in relation to the material world, not in opposition to it, but negotiating with it. The second critique, the idea that identity operates through a philosophical illusion of the totality of self that erroneously places control in individuals, is evidenced in Peta Henton's Situated Knowledge and New Materialism, Rethinking a Politics of Location, in which she implies that the benefit of new materialist accounts of knowledge and agency is that it moves beyond the enunciative politics, another way of referring to identity politics, towards enunciative politics, which is influenced by Haraway's concept of situated knowledge. So this is a quote. In what I would now term enunciative politics, it appears that feminism carries a much broader responsibility than that which would seek to ground and authenticate marginal voices. What Haraway urges us to consider is a politics that is not confined to existing ascriptions of identity, but is rather a form of inquiry that needs to address the capacity for identity as a political gesture. So according to Henton, enunciative politics risks reinvocation of the self-transparent Cartesian subject. Quote, insisting that we account for who it is that speaks or organizing collectively demands a self-presence of that speaking subject and its identity. Further, she worries that claims to authenticity in a feminist politics of location risk enforcing or prescribing representation of what it means to be a certain type of woman. There are two insinuations involved here. First, any attempt to identify the location from which one speaks is necessarily territorial. Second, enunciative politics requires or erroneously assumes self-transparency and self-knowledge. Neither of these strikes me as particularly indicative of the politics of location. Adrian Rich, who coined the term, understood the practice as a mode of self-inquiry and searching undertaken with humility in order to produce more ethical engagements with world and experiences of others. Rather than prescription, politics of location has always been a call to understanding and furtherance of coalitional activism. It's also important to note that this critique impugns intersectional approaches as well as standpoint theory, which advocates for a particular epistemic privilege that comes with experiences of marginalization, both mainstays of Black feminist thought. We can glean from the quote above that enunciative politics is creative rather than descriptive, strategic rather than prescriptive. She further delineates the two by reminding the reader of Haraway's claim that situated knowledges are about communities but not isolated individuals. This supports the idea that enunciative politics is about building identities for political purposes. In contrasting the two in this way, Hinton assumes confluence of identity politics and individualism, referred to earlier, which again strikes me as foreign to the practices of those employing the politics of location. According to Hinton, the benefit of new materialism is that it takes the idea of situatedness even farther in demanding a new form of subjective awareness that is incessantly in flux. A subject's attempts to situate herself is at the same time a process of being situated, a congealing of an identity that cannot be fixed and that cannot exclude the context of its production. But once again, the idea of intersectionality already provides the kind of flexibility and idea of subject and process to which Hinton gravitates. Intersectional feminism was never about fixing identity, but providing a methodological tool for analyzing the complexity of lives. In a word, it is cartographic. While I understand the impetus behind the critique of crude identity politics, I fear that it has become a disabling narrative. New materialism assumes that the theoretical tools they offer are better, as they do not fall prey to the theoretical mistakes of the past, identity politics, metaphysical individualism. That works well if one assumes that there are only poor tools available to start with, which is a very problematic assumption that either seems to leave out or mischaracterize a significant portion of the theoretical tools available. In New Materialism and New Colonialisms, Hinton, Marabi, and Barla claim that New Materialism is unique in its acknowledging the body as a material semiotic actor, and offer this as a promise of how we will begin to understand racialization and colonization differently. They say race clearly matters, and it would be short-sighted to believe that racialized bodies are mere linguistic constructions with no material effects. But who thinks this? This seems to me to be an outcome of the combination of cartographic narratives we have analyzed thus far to suggest that discussions of racialization and colonization have only occurred through the lens of the linguistic paradigm, neglects the racial knowledge that has been constructed by people of color in the US and elsewhere. To suggest that Black theorists or women of color weren't and aren't aware of how the body is involved and imperiled in what it means to be a subject, an actor, and a political entity, or that it's new materialism that first acknowledges the body, does not take into account the narrative tradition that they have developed, which seeks to center their material lives and illuminate the specificity of their embodied existence. The clear truth is that these theorists never abandon the materiality of existence. So the final point of this section, and in response to the critique that focusing on identities detract from the underlying forces and conditions that are pre-personal, molecular, and affective, my position is that we can and should have a multi-pronged approach in how we analyze identities, social formations, and material forces and effects that operate beneath or within them. For Puar, whose critique of intersectionality is situated alongside DELEUZE's assemblage theory as an alternative mode of explanation of events, power relations, and affectivity, it is a matter of ontological irreducibility of a situation rather than thinking through contextual specificity. No matter how specific and nuanced the description of intersectional approach, it continues to reproduce the disciplinary demands of the subject. But Deleuze and Guattari don't make this ontological distinction. Instead, they say that forces operate through self-ascribed conscious interests that are formulated along class lines, race lines, and lines of identification, and unconscious lines of impersonal forces and affects. Recognizing that identities are a conglomeration of associated affects and unconscious forces doesn't negate the reality or the effects of the congealed and collective enunciations. Likewise, Braidotti interprets the duality between the molar and the molecular as one of being between being and fixity, which is the molar, and becoming, which is the molecular. This reading instantiates an ontological difference that doesn't exist in DELEUZE. As all of being is becoming, as well as, yes. And it implies a rigid normative framework where DELEUZE is using these terms descriptively. So she's opting for becoming and saying the molar has to be rejected. While I agree that DELEUZE uses this framework to point to how relations can become fixed and rigidified, the molar and the molecular are not presented as terms opposed in a binary tension, but as Merriman argues, as overlapping tendencies or segmentations. They are terms used in the project of analyses of assemblages and events, which is parallel to DELEUZE's project of analyzing subjectivities and the process of becoming, which is characterized by a dual directionality. This is schizoanalysis, quote from Aaron Gilson, entails both a theoretical project of discovering and analyzing the investments that conduce subjects to desire their own exploitation, and a practical project of reversion to process as an unknown and potentially joyous becoming. These two projects are necessarily conjoined. In Deleuzian terms, our analyses should involve consideration of the molar level of reality and experience, how conscious interests and power accumulate and guide collective forms of enunciation and formulate rigid views of identity, as well as the molecular level where unconscious desires and impersonal forces disrupt and escape from our system of meaning and structures of identity. The implication of Poirot's pitting of intersectionality against assemblage theory is that one must operate according to one paradigm or the other, and clearly it is intersectionality that would need to be jettisoned. But is this really the case? Given the association with Deleuze's concept of assemblage, I would appeal to his pragmatism on this issue. The standard for Deleuze is, does it work? What produces better understanding or a grip on the situation, rather than pitting concepts against each other as a prima facie better or worse? Intersectionality works to make sense of situations where constructs of identity are the primary factor in action and response. How do I have...
You still have at least 5 minutes, but we are not limited by time.
Okay, so I do want to get to the final section if that's okay. So my third cartography is figures of the post-human. So building on the prior two cartographies, there's one more that I would like to consider. And that is the cartography of new materialism's participation in the post-human turn. In their introduction to materialist feminisms, Kuhl and Frost claim that, quote, what is at stake here is nothing less than a challenge to some of the most basic assumptions that have underpinned the modern world, including its normative sense of the human, its beliefs in human agency. That is, the critique of the philosophical history of humanism, which involves the rejection of universalism, Cartesianism, and metaphysical individualism. While post-humanists and new materialists recognize their indebtedness to anti-humanist critiques of postmodern and post-structuralist thinkers and share their desire to abandon the universalist rhetoric of humanism, they agree that the anti-humanist project failed to definitively and completely extricate themselves from the humanist paradigm in ways that reflect the added critical value of the post-dualistic and post-anthropocentric aspects of philosophical post-humanism. The critique of anti-humanism, which has become almost a backdrop for new materialism, is that it retains the metaphysical priority of the subject-other model. Vis-a-vis Gros, all politics which focus on subject-other identification remain indebted to Hegelian master-slave dialectic, and thus cannot wrest themselves free of humanist focus on individualism, hierarchy, and exclusionary logic. The rejection of anti-humanism on the grounds that it reflects an oppositional logic requires the continuation of the humanist political subject. That it reflects an oppositional logic that requiring the continuation of the humanist political subject seems to have generated the alarming position that the moment of speaking about marginalized others is over. To extol the post-human moment, Ferrando invokes Braidotti's definition of the postmodern embrace of anti-humanism as a time when, quote, the devalued others, which constitute the specular complement of the modern subject, return with a vengeance, woman, the ethnic or racialized other, and nature or earth others. In an astonishing yet singularly illuminating claim, Ferrando claims, posthumanism may arise when the need for such a vengeance has been fulfilled, and the voices of the subjectivities, which have been historically reduced to the realm of the other, have been acknowledged. What is astonishing here is both the idea that the posthuman happens on the heels of these marginalized others having been heard, and the implication that this need has been fulfilled. Posthumanism can thus dispense with such categories and attestations. It's this narrative that subtly weaves its way through posthumanism and new materialist critiques that makes theorists like Leong and Jackson, among others, in critical race theory, uncomfortable, to say the least. Rather than drawing from the reservoir of lived experience and Black knowledge concerning the parsing of the human, non-human, inhuman, posthuman, the posthuman deems itself beyond these discussions, which catapults them right back to some pretty damning universalist assumptions about who the subject of theorizing is, at the very least. Posthumanism seems blinded to its own epistemic imperialism, assuming a particular logic, because the posthuman turn recognizing the exclusions of humanism and anti-humanism, it is immune from the critique of exclusion, and further, if Eurocentrism is associated with the humanist allegiance to the subject, then posthumanism, with its rejection of the anthropocentrism, could not be Eurocentric or universalistic. This is how posthumanism can both criticize Eurocentrism and situate itself as poised to redefine a new role for Europe, which is what Braidotti says she's doing in Metamorphosis. We should also ask whether a posthuman project of becoming minoritarian or becoming nomad of Europe, sounding very Heideggerian, I might add, replicates the same fundamental assumptions of the center that it supposedly critiques, namely, does it overlook the fact that becoming nomadic or minoritarian neglects the situation of those who have already been imperceptible, migrant, dispossessed, and minoritarian? The second point regarding this narrative is that it lends to the conflation of an entire history of anti-humanist philosophical and political analysis with metaphysical individualism. Grose's Politics of Imperceptibility is really the definitive example of this. Her critique of any subject-oriented politics shows how deeply connected posthumanism critiques of humanism are to the rejection of reclamations of the subject or identity altogether. Either we ascribe to a theory of the subject that strives to have its identity affirmed through relations, especially relations of desire, but also relations of identification with other subjects. A subject that seeks the recognition of others and a place as a subject within culture, or we ascribe to a theory of the impersonal. So it's either or for Gross. Gross's Politics of Imperceptibility, which endorses the project of, quote, undoing the subject and the reduction of the subject paradigm altogether, is also theoretically problematic. Her conception is inspired by Deleuze's concept of becoming imperceptible, and one might assume the same imperative exists. Yet Deleuze is quite clear that his is not a charge of complete dissolution or rejection of subjectivity. Becoming imperceptible is a kind of breakdown of the boundaries of subjectivity through the opening of oneself to affective encounters. But as Deleuze says, you have to retain enough of yourself to wake up in the morning. Moreover, Deleuze's becoming imperceptible absolutely supports the relevance of consciousness to this process, as one cultivates an awareness of oneself as a receptor of inhuman external forces. In Undoing the Subject, Aaron Gilson refers back to Deleuze to show the ambivalence of merely accepting a politics of imperceptibility. She says, to desubjectify for Deleuze and Guattari does not mean to lose the self, but to find ways to keep the self moving, passing through different affective states, end quote. Gilson's article addresses the problem of viewing this debate about the subject in a zero-sum way, where the only answers are avowal or complete disavowal of identity. Referring to multiple figures within several feminist traditions, Gilson reveals relationality and the idea of an ontogenetic subject as process as central parts of feminist construction of subjects already. Care ethicists, for instance, move beyond an oppositional dialectic of the self by emphasizing relations of dependency and interdependence, and care as a precondition for developing a sense of self. And feminist phenomenologists, appropriating Merleau-Ponty's highly corporealized vision of the interrelation of subject and world in the melded space of flesh, support the idea of a relational subject that is always in the making, rather than a terminal point or ultimate achievement. My supposition is that these traditions remain unseen or undervalued because new materialist feminists have instituted such a clear demarcation. Through the displacement of the anthropos as the privileged center of analysis, new materialists redirect discussions of agency and autonomy by interpreting them as features of materiality as such. In doing so, new materialists desire to bypass the human subject altogether, eliminating considerations of intentionality and consciousness from the discussions of agency, devoting themselves almost exclusively to the inhuman or ahuman, ecological and environmental analyses, and supporting a radical zoe-egalitarianism that extends agency to all material entities. So that's where they end up. But we would do well to move cautiously through what this radical reconfiguration of what agency means and what it potentially leaves out. Karen Barad interprets agency as an expression of potential or force in a relational context rather than a conscious or intentional act, which would require a traditional consciousness. Incidentally, I've come to realize if agency is only the identification of potential or force, it's actually determinism. I mean, there is no agency. The slippage that often accompanies this is from the identification of a kind of agency as a potency or ability to affect that resides in all matter to the denial of the relevance of the latter. New materialism's paradigm regarding the vital nature of matter and existence as composed of enveloped eminent fields of relations coalesces with Deleuze's ontological framework to a large extent, but Deleuze and Guattari's concept of univocity, eminence, or their emphasis on the imperceptible and the inhuman do not lend themselves to the same conclusion of onto-egalitarianism, nor do they eschew the specificity of human thought and desire, or the subject of the incorporeal in general, as significant factors and motivators of assemblages. In other words, the relationship between new materialism and Deleuze and Guattari is complicated, particularly with respect to what gets left out of this cartography. And so I agree with Ian's claim about how assemblage theory has sort of gone off the rails to an extent. It's not just about sort of calculating an additive kind of understanding of material elements. And we have to, this is where I think the next chapter will really now try to reincorporate the incorporeal back into a sort of Deleuzian reading of feminism.
So the discussion is open.
Yes.
Thank you for sort of pointing out that becoming imperceptible is not a one-way street in a sense. It's not just that we escape by becoming imperceptible, but it's also that some things are just not available if we keep thinking in terms of, for example, binary opposites. Mm-hmm. It is a certain hurdle that even maybe the best meaning theoreticians have to overcome and have to sort of open themselves to things that might remain imperceptible in their narrow view, let's say. So I just want to thank you to sort of point this out, because this is something that I don't hear being spoken about very often.
Well, I mean, I think that that is absolutely, so it's interesting because it's a very strange position to take to feminism, right? Because this is the hallmark and the place where binary opposites are really critiqued. There's a whole tradition of it. So you would think that the sort of replication of that kind of problem. And so, I'm wondering about how this happens, and sort of, because I come from, I see myself as a DELEUZIan, and then also as a feminist, but not just a new materialist feminist. When I'm reading new materialism and actually writing for and being rejected as a feminist DELEUZIan, because I'm not giving an interpretation that's new materialist, it really made me start to wonder what is being left out of these narratives. And so the idea of tracing the cartographies was a really fruitful way, because the cartography, at least the way that Braidotti seems to want it to operate, is that it sort of lays out a plan or a diagram that helps reveal, right? But what has happened, and it may be a tendency because we still have such a tendency to think in dualisms, is that it's become a kind of demarcating line where that has become very disabling, right? And so many things become rejected in the process. So it's become territorial in and of itself, which I think is absolutely ironic. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have one.
Yes.
Thank you for that talk. It was really, really rich. Before my questions, also the kind of, with the idea of imperceptibility, it's funny because in Thousand Plateaus they also write, to become imperceptible has a paradox because it's to be perceived by others on a line of flight. Mm-hmm. So already that breaks down the argument. Yeah. Anyways, the one thing that you kind of hinted at but you never quite explicitly said that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on are, what are the politics being implied here? Because it seems as though there's a fairly dark politics implied by new materialists and posthumanism if you take it to a kind of logical.
So yeah, I mean, so I think I did sort of make some implications of my own. I mean, I think that it's very problematic that a whole set of traditions that are actually very political and related to what would be minoritarian politics or what would be related to marginalized people is really sort of like obscured. And I came to that both from my own thinking about how identity politics is being sort of batted around and how Black feminism in the United States sort of gets bound up in that, and it's very debilitating for the conversation. But also I started reading Black feminists and critical race theorists who were also engaging new materialism and realizing that there was a really deep-seated worry and frustration with the occlusion of that which relates to sort of the political and the social dynamics, right? So it's, and it's sort of, I think there's a politics that is being, being perpetuated, but it's a politics of environmentalism, and it's that we need to sort of, move beyond, get over ourselves kind of thing. And it, one of the frustrations I have when I read Braidotti, for instance, or some new materialists, is that they'll say, well, this is great, and we're doing onto-egalitarian ethics, right? And it applies in all these cases, and they'll talk about, how we have to be more sensitive to the varieties of materiality and bodies, and this is going to allow us to be, treat the earth better and treat animals and beings better. And they'll say, and then it's also works with post-coloniality and this, and they'll just string together all the other things, but there's no explanation of how that actually applies. And so I just feel like it's sort of this sort of afterthought. And I think there is a tendency to kind of absolutize or universalize this perspective that is problematic, and that is a dark politics. I think it's exclusionary and to a large degree. And my both in terms of what I do with DELEUZE, with trying to straddle the line between the perceptible and the imperceptible, or the subject and its disillusion. Or between feminisms, it's always to really consider not making the either or creating dualisms, but how do we hold these things together and actually create some productive spaces. And so that is where I'm going. It's to reincorporate the incorporeal and that discussion, not to get rid of some of the things that new materialism is doing, but as Gross, I think she even acknowledges in the book, there's not any good tools in new materialism to talk about the incorporeal. We have to talk about thought. We have to talk about our human interests and the ways that we interact with the environment, and that those create real effects, and to flatten and say that all of these forms of agency are sort of on an equal playing field, I think is just, it's disingenuous, So how do we actually, I really mean to try to use that, my politics would be to notice that these omissions and elisions are being made, and to reincorporate the voices of third world feminism and Black feminism in the United States, which by virtue of their associations have to be rejected if we stick with this model. And I think that that's actually very in line with what DELEUZE would do as well. So you're not just operating, it's not molecularity as opposed to the molar. You have to actually do an analysis of both and at the same time.
Thank you.